Hello, I'm Jeremy. Today I'm going to be taking a look at a roll and write game by the name of Calavera. This is designed by Klaus-Jurgen Wrede, who's most famous for designing Carcassonne. He has many games to his credit, though. Published by Moses Games, it's a game that plays from 2 to 4 players, ages 8 and up. Takes about maybe 15 or 20 minutes to play. It is essentially going to be a Yahtzee-style roll and write game where players are going to be trying to get the most points, but there's a strong push your luck element, which makes it a little bit more interactive than most of the games of this sort. I'll take a few minutes to show you how the game plays, and I'll come back and let you know what I think about it. The game Calavera comes with a 2-sided score pad, as well as 6 dice. They have on them 4 different colors, as well as 2 different symbols. There is a skull and a rose. And this is going to be a game where players are going to take turns rolling the dice, trying to be the player who has the most points at the end of the game. So let me just show you on a completed score sheet that we played with previously. You can see there are rows for the 4 colors that are available on those dice. And you can see essentially what you're going to be doing during the game is putting checks in those rows, going across from left to right. At a certain point, you will either choose to stop by rolling flowers in one of these sections, and then you'll get points for that section. Or if ever you exceed that section, like this player did here, where they end up going past the yellow section, you'll immediately stop and lock that row just for yourself and get the points that are shown up there. So here the player went here, so they get 4 points. Whereas here, the player was able to stop here, they would get 8 points for that row. You'll also get bonus scorings here for being the first person to meet that line in every row, that line, and that line. So those 3 red lines, if you reach those red lines first with all 4 of your colors, you get the top points. If you do it later, you get the bottom points. So you can see 4-2, 5-3, 6-4. So those are some bonus points as well. So the turn structure of the game basically goes that players take turns being the active player, and they get up to 3 rolls. So if a player rolls the dice, what they have to do is they have to set aside any skulls. Those cannot be re-rolled. Then they could choose to re-roll any of the other dice and set aside any of the dice. So maybe they would choose to keep this one here, the rose, and re-roll the others. Now they have more skulls, and that would actually end their turn. So there's basically a few outcomes that could happen, but let me just show you for the sake of demonstration. Let's say that this was their 3rd roll. So the active player, again, any skulls are set aside. Those just indicate if the other players are going to be able to mark something on their sheet. Then the active player is going to pick one of the groupings of dice that they have left. So here we have 1 rose, 2 blue, 1 black. So they could either mark off 1 black, 2 blue, or 1 of anything on their score sheet. And again, you want to make progress along all of your rows, but not exceed this yellow area. So the way this wild works is if the player wanted only 1 blue instead of 2 blue, they could use that instead. They could not combine that with it and do 3 blues. So it's essentially could stand in for any color, but works independently of any of the actual dice of a given color. So their options would be 1 of anything, 1 black, or 2 blue. They would make their choice here, so let's just say they took their 2 blue, they would mark in 2 blue along their blue row. Then, because they rolled the skulls, the other players must choose one of the other groupings to mark down on their sheet. So if there was multiple other players, if you're playing like a 3 or 4 player game, more than one of the other players could choose, for example, 1 of anything, which I think every player would just choose that and mark off 1 thing in any row. So if the player had rolled no skulls, let's say this was their roll, they would simply take their choice. Maybe they took the 2 blue again, and that they would mark that off on their sheet. And since there are no skulls, no other player will mark off anything on their sheets at all. If, as I showed before, the player rolls 3 skulls, then what will happen is the player who was the active player does not get to mark off anything on their sheet, but then the other players would have to mark off either one of the other groupings. So in this case, 1 blue or 2 black. So eventually, like I said, you're going to make progress along these lines, and then you'll end up in these yellow sections. So let me just show you that again. So you can see the yellow sections have above them 2 flowers or 3 flowers. If you take flowers from a grouping. So if there's 2 flowers available and you're in that 2 flower section here, you could then lock down that row. And essentially you just would get the points equal to where you were at. So like for example here, the player was in the orange and they took, while drafting, 2 flowers, they could just essentially cross out the rest of this row and get the points where they're at. So here they would get 6 points. Again, if ever you exceed the yellow section and you go into this edge section here, you are forced to lock down after you fill in your current X's, and you'll get the points that are shown there. So you can see it drops from 10 to 4 to 0 and then to -3 if you really overshoot one of those sections. So basically, the game will just keep going with players taking turns until one player has locked down all 4 of their rows. And then you'll essentially trigger the end of the game. And what will happen is any players who haven't locked down rows will get points for whatever progress they've made. So if you are at the 10 and you just never locked it down, you would just still get that 10 points. And then you'll tally up your points for each of your 4 rows, as well as your points for these bonuses here for making all of your rows reach one of those red lines. Whoever has the most points at the end of the game will be the winner. Alright, so that is Calavera, and I think as you can see, this game is at its core very simple. Doesn't have a lot of rules. What makes it interesting and makes it stand out among the other roll and write games that are, flooding the market here in 2019 is the fact that it is so interactive. The game plays between 2 and 4 players, and I think I might say that I like it best as a 2-player game, because then choosing to re-roll your dice becomes a directly tactical decision, considering what the one other player you're playing against has on their score sheet. Since there's this element in the game where if you exceed the scoring area, you're going to lose a lot of points. It's usually going to be to your advantage to try to contrive situations where the other player is going to take dice that they cannot use, or that negatively affect them. So since it is mandatory to take dice if possible, if a skull is rolled, forcing the other player to take dice, or taking dice to remove the safe dice from the pool so they're forced to take unsafe dice, becomes a nice tactical decision. That is most strongly felt at a 2-player game, because you're really only worried about what one other player is taking. When you play with 3 or 4 players, it becomes increasingly chaotic, because you can't possibly consider what all other players are going to be forced to take from the dice pool that are remaining when you're the active player. It's not so complicated, don't get me wrong. It's just it becomes more of a directed decision in a 2-player game, and I like how that works. Whereas if with 4 players, some players might benefit from what you leave behind as the active player, and some players might be have their entire game ruined. So it just feels a little bit more chaotic as you add the 3rd and 4th player. So I do like this best at 2 players, although it's a fun, light game and it's relatively quick with more players. Otherwise, I feel like there's not a tremendous amount to say about this. The rules are pretty straightforward. There's no, no chance that a player won't understand what you're trying to do. It's certainly an easy game to grasp. It just really puts the onus on you, not so much in terms of strategies, but in terms of how much you want to push your luck. So choosing to re-roll, since three skulls will make it so that you don't get to roll at all, and sometimes choosing to re-roll just to get that 3rd flower so you can lock down a roll, or are interesting decisions to make along the way. So another nice thing is that unlike some roll and write games, this does have an arc over the course of the game. Your priorities are going to be shifting. Early on, you might want to take as many dice as you can in a color. Later in the game, you really have to avoid being in a position where you're taking certain colors. And then once you lock down a row, it only locks down for you. It doesn't lock down for other players. So certain players might really want dice. Other players might want to avoid a given color of dice. So there's a nice narrative arc. And then near the end of the game, it's just a desperate attempt to roll those flowers, and the game could really swing on that, but what can you do? It's a 20-minute roll and write game. Overall, it's, I think, a really pleasant little game that does stand out from the other games in the genre. There's many of them, just by virtue of being so interactive that you're really concerned about what other players are doing to a greater degree than is usual in this type of game. So those are my thoughts on Calavera, a nice short roll and write game that I would recommend. I should mention that it's only available in German right now. The score sheets have a little bit of German on them, but certainly nothing that you couldn't get by. There's a rules translation for the game on Board Game Geek, so I wouldn't let that deter you if you feel like you want to import the game. I don't know that there's a US release scheduled for it yet. So those are my thoughts on Calavera, and thank you for watching.